questions from media organisations that are here, so we'll just take them one by one. And given the lights here, I'm not altogether sure where the media are, but I shall read out the names I've got in front of me. So first of all, James Cook from BBC Network. James? Thanks very much, First Minister. The answer is you've put us right at the back. I'm over here. You've said that leaving a 50-year-old union with the EU has wiped billions from the economy. Why would leaving a 300-year-old union with England not be even worse? No. Before we go any further, right? Before we go any further, I just said I believe in open debate and respectful disagreement, right? So for this bit of the gathering, no questions are to be applauded or heckled, and none of my answers are to be applauded or heckled. Okay, so it's fair rules for everybody. James, would you start again, please? And you'll be heard in silence, James. Well, OK, that's kind of you, First Minister. It struck me as quite a reasonable question, if I'm honest with you. There seems an obvious logic, and I'm interested to hear your answer. So let me just repeat it. You've said that leaving a 50-year-old union with the EU has wiped billions from the economy. Why would leaving a 300-year-old union with England not be worse? The answer is that what independence enables us to do is to take the decisions that are important and relevant to enhancing the lives of people in Scotland. And part of that involves taking sensible decisions about how you cooperate with your neighbours. So if I make the comparison with Brexit, I can't speak to a company in Scotland today that tells me the trading arrangements between the United Kingdom and Brexit have been enhanced by the negotiations that have been undertaken. They have in fact been damaged. So it's not actually the process of taking that decision to establish Scotland as an independent country. It's the decisions you take as a consequence. And if you're interested in having an outward-facing economy that trades with your neighbours effectively and openly, that seeks cooperation and collaboration with your neighbours, as countless European countries do already. You know, the European Union trades freely and happily and has all sorts of cooperation over the many borders that exist between individual European countries. I don't see why that opportunity does not exist for an independent Scotland in relation to our next nearest neighbour, which should be England, and then also in the trading partners in the European Union with whom we would want to be associated and linked as a full member of the European Union. So that's the difference. Right, Phil Sim from BBC Scotland.
Thank you. I know you'd prefer to speak about the principles of independence rather than the process, but your party's put it front and centre in successive election campaigns and won a lot of seats, but come no closer to actually delivering. So I'm just wondering what is different this time and how can you actually move things closer?
Well, I think the whole thing comes down to what's the outcome and what's the result of the election? To what extent do people in Scotland empower the Scottish National Party to deliver independence? And because that's essential in forcing democratic decision-making within the United Kingdom. Now, currently, we have an impasse. We've got a United Kingdom government that is sitting impervious to the democratic wishes and aspirations of the people of Scotland. And I don't think that's sustainable in a democracy, that should be enabled. So the United Kingdom government is the government that's got the problem here, because they're acting in an anti-democratic fashion. And the people of Scotland can take that posturing out of the hands of the UK government by empowering the Scottish National Party and empowering the people of Scotland to make progress on the agenda for independence. We'll come to Skye now. Darren McCaffrey.
Yeah, very good afternoon, John. I'm over here. Thank you. Today, the SNP have accused Keir Starmer of directly harming Scotland with his pledge to reduce migration. But surely, as the Scottish National Party, you would agree with the sentiment that businesses should put the priority of hiring Scots first, that Scots should be front of the queue when it comes to jobs here in Scotland. And second of all, you've been quite honest and frank, actually, about some of the difficulties the SNP are going to face during this election. But what does winning look like for the SNP in this election? Are you, as Stuart Hosey suggested, going to be the largest political party by a country mile still on July 4th?
Thanks, Dan. On the first question about migration, one of the other things that crops up in all my conversations with business is that they are short of people. So, if the unemployment data in Scotland today is very, very low. It's been low for some considerable number of years. We are in a situation where businesses are struggling to find employees to fill the vacancies that they have got. We have in our country a significant issue. I've been very open about this with Parliament, about handling reducing the number of delayed discharges in our hospitals. But of course, to do that, you need to have enough people providing social care packages in the community, and we're short of social care workers in our community. We lost tens of thousands of these good people when Brexit came along, and they all went back to their own countries and their own homes, and they were helping us out here in the Scottish economy. So the biggest economic threat to Scotland is the current hostility towards migration that we have in the United Kingdom. That is absolutely... Now, I said no applause. However much you like it. We could have applause at the end. But so the migration issue is and if you look at any analysis about economic growth and economic opportunity, population growth is one of the most significant drivers of economic growth. All the economic analysis says that. So we're literally turning off economic opportunity as a consequence of the stance on migration. And then in relation to your second part of your question, Darren, about what's the outcome like for the SNP? Well, I want the SNP to be the largest party in Scotland after this election. And I want to make sure as many of these fine people behind me are elected to do exactly that. Right, Alex Thompson from Channel 4. Alex.
Good afternoon, First Minister. Why are Labour doing so well in Scotland?
Well, there's clearly, I think there's two things that are probably kicking about just now. There has been, the SNP has faced its difficulties. That's why I'm here, and we're getting out of those difficulties, and we're on the front foot. I've had a fabulous couple of weeks around the country with very, very energetic campaign teams out and about around the country. I visited 6 of them yesterday, all of them in the north east of Scotland, all of them very, very dynamic in taking forward our message. And the second thing that's happened is that I think people have not really been engaged in the hard choices of this election. And in the hard choices of this election, and I was raising one of these on Friday, we've had prolonged austerity from the Conservative government. And that needs to come to an end. I made it clear on Friday, I believe that's got to come to an end. But as I look at the Labour Party has committed not to increase income tax, not to increase corporation tax, not to increase national insurance, not to increase VAT. They've committed to tight borrowing limits, and they've committed to tight fiscal spending envelopes. And the IFS, the Institute for Fiscal Studies, tell us that for all that to happen, £18 billion worth of public spending cuts need to happen. Now, I intend to make sure everybody in Scotland knows that will be the consequence of a Labour government between now and the 4th of July, because we can't cope with any more austerity. So my answer, Alex, on my second part of my answer to your question, is that people don't quite know what the Labour Party is actually promising, but I'm going to make sure they do by the 4th of July. Right, now remember, Alan Jasinski from Global. Alan.
Yeah, hi. Stuart Hosey said there is no credible alternative independence vote. What would your message be to supporters of Alex Salmond's party who say that's not true?
I think it's pretty obvious, and history tells us this, that Scotland only does well when the SNP does well. And I would just say to people, if you're interested in Scottish independence, don't be distracted. Vote for the SNP, because we're the party of independence and we'll deliver it. Right, Paul Hutchin from the Daily Record. Paul.
First Minister, two things. What's your reaction to the Sunday Times story this morning on £450 million of funds that you'll have to give back to the EU? And secondly, the former SNP Chief Executive Peter Murrell was charged recently in connection with embezzlement of party funds. How can party members and SNP donors have faith and confidence that the money they give to the SNP, their hard-earned money, is spent properly?
First thing, Paul, on the Sunday Times story, clearly the EU funding programmes have not reached their conclusion. They'll reach their conclusion over probably the next 12 to 18 months. My expectation would be that almost all of that funding that you're talking about will be spent and essentially delivered as a consequence of the EU programme. So the Sunday Times story this morning, it takes a snapshot of a programme that has not reached its completion yet, and my expectation would be when it reaches its completion, almost all of that expenditure will be spent. On the second point about party funding, all I would say to party members and to donors is that I give them my personal assurance that every penny raised for the Scottish National Party will be spent effectively and appropriately on the Scottish National Party election campaign and on winning independence. From the FT, Simeon Kerr.
Thank you, First Minister. Could you please clarify the SNP's position regarding North Sea oil and gas? Do you think that there should be new, fresh exploration, or is that actually inconsistent with your long-term net zero goals? Thank you.
Well, I think what we've got to do is we've got to take an approach that ensures that we work with the oil and gas sector on our journey towards net zero, that we consider at all times the implications of any fossil fuel activity on our long-term activities in relation to net zero. But what I recognise is that the North Sea oil and gas sector has got to be fiscally sustainable for two reasons. One, to support itself in the current context, but also to be able to deliver the transition to net zero, where we need the oil and gas sector to be part of that process of transition. So the Scottish National Party wants to work closely with the oil and gas sector to ensure that we take an approach on oil and gas activity that is compatible with our journey to net zero, but we do it in a fashion that delivers fiscal sustainability for the sector. Libby Brooks from The Guardian.
Thank you. When Keir Starmer was visiting Greenock last Friday, he talked about the damaging conflicts that there have been ongoing between the UK and Scottish governments, and he pledged to improve that relationship should he become Prime Minister. Do you commit to working with him on that and that toxicity that we've seen, even if, as he suggests, it ends up denting support for independence?
Well, I've been engaged in intergovernmental relations with the UK government for many years, and I've had many occasions where that has been successful and constructive, and many where it's been difficult and we've not been able to get agreement. But for most of the time, that's been a reasonably respectful environment. I would actually say that my experience of the Brown government, the Cameron and Clegg government, the following Cameron government and the Theresa May governments were generally, on issues that affected people's lives, pretty constructive. I have to say, I was part of those discussions, and I thought generally it was a pretty constructive environment. After the arrival of Boris Johnson, intergovernmental relationships I would essentially describe as disrespectful. We didn't change, they did. So if Sir Keir Starmer is saying, should he become Prime Minister, that he's keen to have a serious, mature, respectful engagement with the Scottish Government, he'll have absolutely no issues with me, because I think people know me well enough to know I'm a serious player when it comes to these negotiations. I did, after all, manage to negotiate a fiscal framework which was enormously beneficial for Scotland. So I'm interested in serious negotiation. But I also know what disrespectful relationships look like, and they've existed since Boris Johnson walked into 10 Downing Street. Lewis Mackenzie from The Sun.
Thank you, First Minister. Hamza Yousaf had spoken about launching into talks on independence if the SNP was to win the most seats in Scotland. You've spoken about your sort of aim to win the most seats in Scotland. Would you, if the SNP wins the most seats in Scotland, will you take that as a direct mandate to begin negotiations on independence, or would you request the powers to hold a referendum in that case?
Well, I would always want to have the powers to hold a referendum, Lewis, because I recognise that the referendum route is the most authoritative, definitive route for the people of Scotland to be asked that question. I think it was well established in 2014, so that's what I would want to ensure was the case. So that would be the purpose of my discussions with the United Kingdom, to make sure people had that democratic choice. And as I said in my answer, one of my earlier answers, the unwillingness of the UK government to engage on that question is a significant obstacle to what we are trying to do. But I would want to engage in those discussions. I'd want to engage in those discussions early, and I'd want to make sure that we had the opportunity to have that referendum so that people could make a choice on the important question of independence. And I think it's a fundamentally democratic argument. Can I now take David Ball from Scotsman? David?
Thanks very much. Going back to the oil and gas question, can you just explain a little bit of why you're sort of rethinking that position? Is it to do with vote winning in the North East? And can you guarantee that the Scottish Government's energy strategy, which is already delayed, will be produced and voters will get to see it before the election?
Well, on the last point, David, as you would see from the letter that I published on Tuesday from the Permanent Secretary to the Scottish Government, there are a whole range of different government publications which I committed to publish before the summer recess, which I'm not going to be able to publish because of the pre-election guidance that comes into place, which obliges us to ensure that we don't take any actions as a government that influence the outcome of the election. Documents such as the energy strategy will not be able to be published because they essentially deal with reserved issues. So on that question, we will not be able to publish that document in that timescale. On the wider question of oil and gas, I'm interested in doing two things. I'm interested in achieving net zero, but I'm also interested in doing that in a way that does not cause economic damage to the economy of Scotland, and particularly to the North East of Scotland. So that has to be a managed transition to ensure that we undertake that transition as effectively as we possibly can, minimising any economic damage as a consequence of a transition that has got to be made. Can I come to James Walker from The National?
Thank you, First Minister. I'd like to go back to Keir Starmer's pledge to cut net migration to the UK. What do you think about his rhetoric, the control our borders, British jobs for British people-esque rhetoric?
I think it's playing to a particular audience, and it's not one that exists in Scotland. That's what I think about it. And I don't think it's discussion, I don't think it's language that helps us, because as I've mapped out in my earlier answer, all of the issues of population growth are central to how we perform as an economy. And I want the Scottish economy to thrive. I want there to be more economic opportunity. I want to make it possible to address the difficulties and the challenges that business face. But when a business sits in front of me and says, we can't recruit enough staff, I'm kind of limited in what I can say to them, because we're at almost full employment, we've got very low unemployment, and we don't have other people who can contribute. But migration helps you. That's how economies grow. So I don't think the language helps us, either in terms of our view of the world or also in terms of the economic opportunity. Can I now come to Jess North from the Daily Mail? Jess?
Hi, First Minister. I just wanted to reference a poll that came out this morning. 59% of Scots think that the independence argument has not moved on since 2014. Now, seeing as all of your candidates have put independence front and centre, I'm wondering what more they could say that hasn't already been said to convince the general public. And also, your opponents are calling this a desperate relaunch. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but is this the second or the third campaign launch that your party's had this year?
Well, let me just talk about the first point. I think what I've tried to do so far in this election campaign is to illustrate, and this is the direct answer to your question, Jess, about the arguments for independence. What I've been trying to do over the last couple of weeks is to relate independence to the everyday lives of people in Scotland. So let's look at the three decisions I've highlighted today, or the three factors: austerity, Brexit, and the cost of living. Austerity, cuts to public spending, challenges in having enough money for our health service to adequately meet the needs of the population. Brexit, every company finding it difficult to do trade with Europe as a consequence of what's happened. Cost of living, every household suffering because of hyperinflation presided over by a government in the United Kingdom that got it all wrong. Higher interest rates because of Liz Truss's gamble with the markets and all the rest of it. ABC, austerity, Brexit, cost of living, all of that has been inflicted on Scotland by a Westminster government, and it doesn't have to be like that, because we could take our own decisions to prioritise the choices and the investments necessary for Scotland, as we have done, about eradicating child poverty with the child payment, or early learning and childcare, where we've doubled the provisions since we came to office, or where we've significantly invested in new infrastructure in our country. The first trains came out of Leaving this morning on a new railway line built under SNP government. I was up in the North East yesterday, the Aberdeen Western Peripheral route. We drove up that yesterday, promised by every government of every colour for 40 years, but delivered by the SNP in the North East of Scotland, transforming the economy. So we can deliver. We can take the right decisions here in Scotland. But if the powers lie in Westminster, we're liable to get more of the standard of decision-making, if I can call it that, of austerity, Brexit and the cost of living. And we don't want that any longer. Now, on your point, Jess, about this gathering, well, this gathering was actually planned before the election was called. It was going to take place next Sunday. And what it was originally scheduled to be was the first opportunity for this wonderful party to see its new, fresh-faced young leader in front of it. But more importantly, to ask him questions, which we're going to come on to do in a little bit of time. Because I promised I would make sure there would be effective internal democracy in this party, and that's what's just about to happen, or the first stage of it is about to happen. So folk can muck about with whatever terminology they want about what events are what and all the rest of it. This is a gathering of good, solid folk who want to work together to achieve success for the SNP and Scottish independence. It's lovely to see you all. Right, now, Dan Sanderson from Telegraph. Dan?
Thank you, First Minister. Don't you have a bit of a cheek to tell people to vote SNP to protect the NHS when just a few days ago we found out that waiting lists had spiralled to a record high? And also, those 690,000 people that are on waiting lists, why wouldn't they welcome more private sector investment if it meant actually getting seen quicker? Thank you.
Well, see, I suppose your question, Dan, is answered by West Streeting, because it all goes back to London. It's all about, so let's look at all this, right? We've passed on all the Barnett consequentials to the health service in Scotland that have come to us from the UK government. We've also, various ministers in the Cabinet and government, taken decisions over a number of years to ask people in Scotland, higher earners, to pay slightly more in taxation than they would pay if they were in the rest of the United Kingdom. And that's resulted in us now having £1.5 billion per annum more to spend on public services in Scotland, which a large proportion of which is going into the National Health Service. So we're actually taking the hard decisions to expand health expenditure because we recognise it's necessary. We're passing on all that's coming to us from the Westminster Government, but it's not addressing the needs of people because of austerity. So, to me, that's the answer to your question, Dan. It's all about recognising that austerity is now punishing us, and it's a programme that's been inflicted on Scotland by a United Kingdom government, and we've got to bring that to an end. And I fear, from all that I'm hearing from the Labour Party, is that austerity will not just be continued, the Labour Party is going to put austerity on steroids, and that's damaging for Scotland.